If we were to superimpose insulin on this, it would look something like this, where we can see that there are two distinct time points. The first one being a state of just what we would call insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. It is so important to appreciate that the insulin is elevated in this state, but not the glucose. These are not the same thing. And a GP understands, a clinician knows this. A clinician knows that insulin and glucose are not the same thing. In their minds, so often, the two can't help but go together. That they are linked hand in hand, and that if the glucose is high, then the insulin is high. Or, more often, if the glucose is normal, then insulin must be normal. It is only when the body has become so resistant to its own insulin that even though there is still an abundance of insulin, and if it is type 2 diabetes, it is always an abundance of insulin. Insulin never goes down to zero, or even close in type 2 diabetes. The body is swimming in a sea of insulin, and it just can't work well enough to control the blood glucose levels. We cannot look at these as equal numbers all the time. Now, we obsessively focus on glucose. It has become the metric that matters to most conventional clinicians, but it shouldn't be. I understand the reasons for it. It's because historically, the most prominent display or evidence of the disorder was the urine production, which is what diabetes means, producing a lot of urine. And that is a direct consequence of the sugar, the blood sugar level. So glucose can be elevated about 10 or more years after the insulin has already been elevated. This is well documented in prospective studies. We have to shift from the glucose-centric paradigm to an insulin-centric paradigm if we hope to really identify the problem. Stress, and next, and one more. Inflammation and hyperinsulinemia, which I just got done describing to you as a consequence of insulin resistance and a cause. Each of these are independent, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to define the top two. In this scenario, too much insulin, as the body is flush with insulin, it becomes increasingly less sensitive to insulin. And this is reflective of a fundamental biological principle. It doesn't matter what we're talking about in life, too much of something will result in a resistance to that something. Now let me give you a funny little analogy. This is me and my wife and our darling little children. And sometimes darling, sometimes demonic. But my darling wife is a full-time homemaker, which means she's full-time PTA at the school, she's full-time involved in our church, full-time involved in play groups with the kids. When I say full-time, I mean full-time. But it means that she's around the kids quite a bit more than I am. And she is used to hearing the noise of the children. And this really leaves an impression on me when I'm home with all our darling little cherubs and when I'm with the family. And I will hear the kids screaming for something. And I'm amazed that my wife doesn't register it at all. She's become somewhat deaf to this signal. Why? Because she hears it so much. She has learned to just drown it out. And if it's true crisis, then she can respond. Well, I'm not around the children as much, and so I hear everything. And I react. I have an action to the screaming, whereas my wife is quite content to let it go. She's become a little deaf to the children's screams. I'm not. I'm acutely sensitive to them.